everybody, to episode 5 of our online series. Let me just give a few housekeeping notes before we begin. First of all, our next symposium will be on May 20, 2025, and tickets go on sale next week, so please keep an eye out for our newsletter with that information. New this year, we will have a paid subscriber for our online community. Those people will be known as innovators, and they will get discounted tickets to the symposium. So we do hope that you will become a paid subscriber and enjoy the symposium at a discount. Also, with our online series, we will be introducing some online events that will be exclusive to paid subscribers. For example, my friend who was with me today, Irving Wladawsky-Berger, and I will be hosting an open Q&A in January. And then we have some other people lined up to come in and do presentations on topics that should be of interest to you. And those will also have room for some Q&A. But again, those will be exclusive to our paid subscriber community. The other thing is that if you do become a paid subscriber, you'll be invited to the pre-event, which is on May 19th. That'll be like last year. We'll have quite a bit of networking, a formal debate, some roundtable discussions, a cocktail reception with the Innovation Showcase, and the CIO Leadership Award dinner, which is something that both Irving and I are extremely passionate about. So today we have a nice conversation planned for you. We're going to talk about how is AI likely to evolve in the future, and why is it so difficult to predict? So with that, Irving, how are you today?
I am good, Allan. I have very much enjoyed our 4 previous online fireside chats, so I'm looking forward to this one.
Yeah, so with this one, I was thinking that maybe to begin, we should start with a historical context, especially given, you've been involved in AI for many, many years. You've really seen a lot of it evolve. I won't say that you were there from the very beginning, because that would be like our fathers or grandfathers, but you have been watching this for a long time, and there's been a number of eras for AI. And so let's break it up and start kind of at the beginning, the early days of MIT with Minsky and other people like that. What, in your view, how did this all get kicked off in the beginning?
Yeah. So let me go back to when I think people started thinking about the notion of machine intelligence. And in fact, if you look at the 1940s, when computers just started to get developed, mostly initially in military applications, some of the really pioneers, like Alan Turing, were thinking about, gee, I wonder what's the relationship between computers and human intelligence. And Alan Turing is famous for a number of things. One of them is the Turing test. How can you tell if you are having a conversation with another human at the other end of a line that you cannot see, or with a machine? And if you cannot tell if it's a human or a machine, the machine has passed the Turing test. And he did that, I think, roughly in the 1940s. Then, as computers kept advancing a little more, the field of computer sciences got developed. Some of the pioneers of computer sciences at universities like MIT and Stanford and others got together at a meeting in Dartmouth University, to start thinking about creating a new discipline to see how, as computers got more powerful, we would be able to program just about anything humans can do. That was their objective. And they discussed, what do we call this? And they eventually settled, okay, let's call it artificial intelligence, because that has a ring to it, has sort of marketing well. And then over the next few decades, the 60s and the 70s, the field of artificial intelligence was,
Well, hold on. Before we
yeah,
get into the
okay,
future, let's just stay in the early days for a moment,
yes,
okay? So,
sure,
one of the things, so one of these early meetings was actually a few years before I was born. And kind of when I looked into this, what struck me is that early ideas about like neural networks and stuff
yes,
were written back in the 40s and 50s, which
yes,
is kind of amazing, really, that people were thinking about this so early on, and that it's really just come to fruition now in the 21st century. But also, one of the things that I was reading is that Turing and others had a bias towards traditional programming, what they call old-fashioned AI or symbolic programming. And what I've what I understood was they actually believed that this approach to AI could replicate human thinking, which from my perspective, from 2024 or almost 2025, it's hard for me to imagine that they believe that. So can you just comment on the bias of the researchers at the time?
well, and remember I mentioned Alan Turing started thinking about intelligence, and then uh, I'm assuming that around the same time in the 40s, um, when people were studying the brain and things like that, they started developing the notions of neural networks in the brain. And so when people started saying, gee, if that's how humans think and that's intelligence in humans, maybe something like neural networks would be the basis on a machine. But that was just the beginning of thinking about all this. However, the field was started not by biologists or people thinking about the human brain, but by computer scientists. And there was a history shows, and I wasn't there, I was still in my early teens in Havana at the time, that they had a meeting in Dartmouth University, and they decided to develop a new discipline, which they decided to call artificial intelligence. And its objective was to be able to program a computer to do just about anything that a human could do. And they very much, remember, they were computer scientists who started this, were thinking about programming. And as far as I know, the early thoughts of neural networks were set aside and didn't return until we get to the 1990s.
So, Irving, my understanding is that somewhere in the 60s or 70s, there was tremendous optimism about this
Oh, yes,
approach to AI. And in fact, at least one researcher made the comment that, he thought, machines were going to be able to replicate human thought within like 20 years. And
definitely.
what do you attribute this tremendous? I mean, obviously, the guy was completely wrong. But it does seem to be a pattern in history where there's a certain group of people who become overly enthusiastic or optimistic, and what do you attribute it to in this case?
Well, they were very, remember, we're talking now about places like MIT and Stanford and other very good universities. And this felt so excited. And they all felt, listen, computers are going to get faster. So we know we won't be able to do these things now, but let's start building the early prototypes. And then as computers get faster, we'll be able to do things. And I remember in MIT, in the 1970s, I joined IBM Research after finishing school. And my first management job in IBM in 1974 was a small group that was doing artificial intelligence, natural language understanding, and things like that. And so I had quite a bit of connection with the MIT groups. And they were doing some interesting experiments. For example, somebody had already written a program, AI program that could play checkers. They were trying to see if they can expand that to a program that would play chess. As we know, that didn't come until the late 90s. So, it was all the excitement of a new discipline before you hit the wall that says this doesn't work.
All right. So you were doing this at IBM in the 1970s. And so the AI winter, as I understand it, hit in the 80s and 90s. And so you lived through that. What can you say about the AI?
Yeah, well, because what happened is there was a lot of excitement, a lot of hype. Remember, when you're very excited and you want the governments to fund you, you're going to promise the sun and the moon and the stars. And this is so exciting. You get a lot of notoriety, a lot of articles written. But eventually, and this started to happen in the, I would say, mid to late 70s, the people funding you say, I'm sorry, you haven't gotten anything done. This is all very exciting, but it's not working. So the funding stopped, and that's what we call the AI winter. In the 80s, actually, the Japanese government started a very exciting new program called the fifth generation computing, which was going to be all about AI, and they invented a new language called Prolog. I remember in 81 going to Japan when they launched this fifth generation computer effort. But again, 5 years later, a second AI winter. It just didn't work. And AI basically had disappeared as a major field until it got reborn in the 90s.
Yeah. So, okay. So before we move on to post AI winter, I just want to go on record here that you did mention how funding influences researchers to be optimistic.
Absolutely.
This is something you and I have talked about many times, and is a problem across many research trends, and something that we need to deal
And
with.
we
But
talk about this when we discuss Irving, how do bubbles happen with new technologies? And we saw that with the dot-com bubble, because it's not only the technologies that get excited, often investors get excited, and often they get overly excited. So this is actually very common. And,
yeah,
and
it's
it's like that
very
for,
common, and something I think we all should keep in mind when we listening to the hype cycle. But anyway, getting back to AI, so
yes,
the AI winter happened. Now the turn of this century happens, and we get into the big data era, and all of a sudden we find ourselves with very high-speed processors. The so-called exponential cycle of processor improvement has been going on cycle after cycle. Moore's law. We got more data that we know what to do with, and the whole landscape changed. So where are we now as we
well,
approach the current?
what happened in the 90s is all of a sudden people starting to apply a whole different methodology to the notion of AI. And let me give the concrete example of Deep Blue, which was an IBM supercomputer that accomplished one of the major objectives that people tried in the 60s and 70s, which is play championship level chess. And instead of trying to program how the top people play championship level chess, which you couldn't program because nobody understood how Garry Kasparov, who at the time was the top chess player in the world, did it. So instead, you got huge amounts of information about chess games and so on. And you ask the supercomputer, and in fact, in the IBM Deep Blue project, they used one of the supercomputers that IBM had developed, and they had algorithms that every time the machine had to make a move, it looked through its data of thousands of past games, and it said, it sort of analyzed, when I'm in this position, which moves were successful, that is, it ended up winning the game, and which moves were not successful, and you lost the game. So by analyzing data, Deep Blue was able to make a prediction of what are the moves that are more likely to win the game. And it was totally statistical. And sometimes they got it right and sometimes they got it wrong. And that was the beginning of the data-driven approach to AI. And then, as you said, a few very important things started to happen at the turn of the 21st century. Number one, because the internet had been so successful in the 1990s, all of a sudden, we started getting gigantic amounts of digital data that were coming from the internet. Just lots and lots of digital data that were generated when people were using the internet, writing emails, writing blogs, interacting with each other, and so on. Point number one. Point number two, remember you mentioned neural networks?
Mm-hmm.
So a number of very sharp people started to develop neural network algorithms that were able to start analyzing all this data. So what the people in the 40s anticipated might be a way of doing machine intelligence started to come through in the early 2000s. And number three, remember Moore's law, that every 2 years or so, computers got faster and faster. By the time we got into 2000s, computers, and especially parallel computers, were much, much faster. So these three ingredients that were necessary got together: a lot of data, sophisticated machine learning models, and increasingly powerful supercomputers. And bingo, that was the beginning of our present era of machine learning AI.
Yeah, so let me just try to add a little color to this, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that all that you say that happened at the turn of the century, big data, faster processors, all that happened. We were starting the AI winter turned into the AI spring. We started experimenting. We had some successes. We had Big Blue. We eventually, had that IBM computer that won at Jeopardy.
Right,
Later on, we had that computer that eventually won at Go, which
right.
really nobody thought.
Nobody expected that because
But
Go is so
but
much more
but we did
complicated
it.
than chess.
But nevertheless, until I would say like the uh, 2014, 15, something like that, in the early days of OpenAI, my understanding is that the researchers there took kind of a quiet approach to developing neural networks for fear of, there was still skepticism that this could work, and they wanted to prove it. And so, there was this phenomenon of the chat bots kind of coming on the scene all of a sudden, but in fact, they had been people were working on them in the background, but just keeping it under their hat for fear of uh,
Yeah.
either criticism or loss of funding. So it's a very, in my view, a very interesting development how it all came about.
Well, uh, first of all, in the 2010s, machine learning kept advancing more and more. And at Stanford, and there is this famous Stanford professor, Fei Li, did some very, very important work that was the equivalent of, gee, how can we get machine learning AI to recognize a cat, something that we cannot program how to recognize a cat because we don't know how humans recognize a cat. So she did all these experiments of teaching machines how to recognize images by showing the machine thousands and thousands of the images you wanted to recognize. And then the machine learning algorithms had to figure out how to do that. And whenever the machine learning whenever you show it a picture, if it was a cat, you say cat. And if it wasn't a cat, you say not a cat. And eventually the algorithm was trained. That's the term we use to recognize what you want. And we can do that for all kinds of things. And then the machine learning became deep learning, which was much more layers of stuff, much faster computers. And I think deep learning is what was needed to do AlphaGo, the program that beat the then reigning Go champion. In the meantime, other people started trying to teach even more advanced algorithms to uh, pretty much be able to answer your questions expressed in natural language and give you the answer in natural language. And that's what then led to generative AI and large language models. And there were initial experiments on how to do this. And as you said, they were kept a little low because we didn't know if it was going to work. But I would say by the late 2010s, by 2017, 18, people were doing more and more on that.
Yeah,
And
I think 2017 was when GPT-2 was released. Is that right?
yes, and people were amazed how well it did. It wasn't perfect and it didn't do it better. But as computers got faster and as you use more and more data in their training, you got GPT-3, eventually you got GPT-4. And then a few years ago, OpenAI, instead of just keeping it to themselves, released ChatGPT to the world. And it looked magical that you can ask the AI questions and it would understand it, not all the time, but it did an incredible job. and then it would generate an answer also in a natural language. Now, there were problems like the answers, because the machine was trained with data from the internet and it was all statistical. But sometimes the machine got it wrong. And it's what we call hallucinations, is what people started to call it. And it got it wrong. And
Well, yeah, although humans read data on the internet and get it wrong too.
yeah, well, but we expect the machine to be a machine. But given that the machine is trained from data that comes from humans, sometimes it gets confused and it makes a mistake. And sometimes the mistakes are the kinds of mistakes no humans with common sense would ever make.
Well, so you're saying that the AIs are part of the human condition. But
Are part
anyway, look,
in some ways they are superior, and in other ways they are inferior.
all right, so look, we're coming up now to the present day.
Yes.
Everybody's using AIs. Google has an AI, Microsoft, OpenAI, Grok on X, which I've come to like lately, as I've mentioned to you.
Yes.
And I use a bunch of different ones and kind of compare the way they answer my questions. So certainly, we all know that an AI is very good to do research as a sort of a conversational tool, an assistant. Um, there's no question about that. And there's no question that there's a lot of money being invested right now,
Yeah.
and people are developing this very speedily. But as we've talked about, this isn't the first time that we've had a new technology on the scene, a new shiny
Yeah.
object.
Right.
And the fact of the matter is, it always takes a long time to go from exuberance to implementation, sometimes decades. We've seen it with electricity, we've seen it with the internet. So talk about the barriers.
Well,
Like here we are, we got this thing, but we know it's going to take time. What say you?
well, this is what I say. We know that it's going to take time, but humans sometimes get overexcited and they forget that it takes time, and they start predicting this new technology is going to do what we say it's going to do much faster than you think. And sometimes the predictions come from the technologies, the computer scientists, the scientists, because if you want to get government funding or if you want to get investments for your projects, you have to um, overpromise. You have to tell people, and remember, Silicon Valley has often been accused of overpromising before they can deliver.
Irving, I'm shocked.
Yes,
Shocked.
I know you're shocked. And and then Wall Street gets very excited because there is nothing, if you're an investor, that you like more that to get in on the ground floor and invest in startups that will soon become billion-dollar companies, and you'll get a fantastic return for your investment. And that combination of over-promising beyond what the technology can do now and over-investing before you start getting ROIs is what leads to bubbles. And Alan, you and I are old enough, as are most of the people listening to us, to remember the dot-com bubble of the internet in the 1990s, which is exactly what happened.
So okay, but I'm going to say that history doesn't repeat itself. History is an echo Like there's similarities, there's also differences. Let's talk about some of the differences with AI. So first of all, as we build out these big large language models, we are going to be consuming a lot of power, right? And so there's a expense factor to using these big machines to solve certain problems that, is it even cost effective compared to having workers? So let's start there. The cost of using these big machines.
Yeah, so for a new technology to be very successful, not only does it have to do something well, but it has to do it at a cost that is significantly less than what the previous technologies did, because then you can have a whole new business model. And, if you look at a lot of the advances of the internet, first, it let us do things like you and I now talking to each other over the internet. We're having a conversation, but the cost of us talking to each other is very low because the cost of a laptop or a smartphone or any kind of computer that people use to interact with the internet and with each other have gone down tremendously, and getting an internet connection doesn't cost all that much. So these costs have come down, and that's why so many companies have been so successful using the internet for all kinds of new things. Now, here we are with AI. People forget, I think, how new this present generation of data-driven AI, machine learning, deep learning, large language models, foundational models, they are relatively new, especially the big ones that do large language models that led to ChatGPT. Allan, what would you say, 5 years since that started to get out there? And
Well, no, even less, really.
yeah,
I,
so,
I mean, because when I started in my current job, AI wasn't even on the scene, or at least not the chatbots.
yeah, yeah. Well, no, but it wasn't, I would say,
2022, maybe we really
yeah,
started.
yeah, and I would say even machine learning, there were already people working on it, but the world didn't catch on that these were very useful until I would say 10, 12 years ago. That's when machine learning and deep learning started taking off, let alone the chat GPT and so on. So as we said before, it takes a historically transformative technology, often decades, to be deployed into the marketplace because there is so much work to be done.
So, in the case of AI, would you consider? I think that there is some intangibles with regards to employment. So, for example, job displacement, concerns about privacy, concerns about uh, AI hallucinating or sometimes getting things wrong because the data isn't cleansed enough. There's a lot of human factors
There is a
with
lot.
respect to adoption. And do you think that's the same
Yeah,
with respect to, say, electricity or the internet?
but
Nothing new or
there is
unique?
that's what you're asking. There is a lot of difference of opinion, not unlike what we saw in the mid to late 90s with the internet. And let me give you two concrete examples that I recently wrote about in my blog. The first one is AI will help significantly improve GDP growth and workplace productivity. Now, that's very important because the productivity of the economy has gone up very slowly over the past 10, 15 years. So any technology that could significantly improve workforce productivity, that is, a worker now using these new technologies can get a lot more work done than before. And that will really translate into big productivity growth for the economy. So people have been forecasting that within the next 5 years, it will improve a lot, the productivity and the growth of GDP. Now, here comes MIT economist Daron Acemoglu, who, by the way, in October was a co-recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economics. So you and I agree, Daron is a very sharp guy. You don't get Nobel Prizes in economics just willy-nilly. And he did his own analysis. And in his analysis, he said, in 5 years, the productivity growth I'm getting is about 10% of what other people are predicting. And other people said, Daron, you're wrong. I mean, they said you're wrong before he got the Nobel Prize. I suspect after that, it was a little bit hard to say he was wrong. And when I was writing my blog, I read an interview that the Goldman Sachs research did with Daron, and they said, Professor Acemoglu, why are you so much more conservative than other people who are predicting advances much faster? And Daron said, look, it's a matter of time. If you ask me, how about AI 10, 20 years from now, I'm all in. It is going to be the most fantastic technology that you can imagine for the next several decades. Remember what you said? It takes often decades for technologies to achieve our objectives. So his difference on opinion was what people were predicting in 5 years versus what you would be able to get 10, 20 years from now. Now, let me tell you about the second. Can I tell you, or you want to ask me about this first?
No. I just have a little comment about Darren, but I'll hold it and you continue.
So here is the second area that caught people by surprise, which is that the head of financial prediction in Goldman Sachs, this is finance, said that he doesn't see an ROI currently for AI, and he doesn't see it because companies like OpenAI are investing so much money, but so much money to develop the models, the GPT-4, GPT-4o, and the next ones, then the amount of computing power that you need to run those models is huge. They have to buy GPUs, which are very expensive, and then you need all the electricity to run those models and those GPUs. So by the time you're through, the leading edge companies are investing over $1 trillion in the AI the AI applications. And when you look at what are we getting for those investments, not all that much yet. So the return on investment for the $1 trillion and more that companies are getting and startups are getting, he doesn't see that. Remember, this is the head of finance at Goldman Sachs, and he caught everybody. They said, but he must be wrong. How can this be the case? And And you know what happens when business and financial people overinvest when the return of investment isn't there? That's a definition of a bubble. So that's why these things are currently areas of contention.
All right, so I'm going to make a quick comment, hopefully humorous, and then I'm going to move on to the present day and investment in AI. So, I have great respect for Darren, and I would just remind everybody that, even though he did win the Nobel Prize, everybody does need to have a little bit of humility because, after all, even Paul Krugman won the Nobel Prize, and well, we know how his predictions have gone. So, with that little tongue in cheek, let me move on to the present day. Let's talk about the applications where people who are going to come to the symposium in May, right? They can look forward to maybe having being able to invest in AI. So I'm just going to start off with a couple that I think are pretty obvious. People are investing for customer service, first level customer service to answer questions. I think most people have used these. AI is also being used in human resources in order to, say, scan resumes. I can imagine you could do an AI interview sometime in the near future. I think work is being done, say, in finance and accounting, although in that case, I think there's a little bit of a complication because when you get a very high stakes area, and there's risk, and the current LLMs don't have full transparency. We don't always know exactly why they come to their answers. There's some concerns about hallucination. That's not so great if you're in
Also
financial.
concerns that when the AI makes a recommendation, you may not be able to explain how it got its recommendation, which is a problem.
Yeah, and I think, going back to our earlier conversation, as I recall, that was one of the motivators for why the early researchers sort of lean towards programming and
Exactly.
symbolic
Because
methodologies.
programming is not statistical, it is deterministic.
It's deterministic, and so I think that the transparency was attractive.
Yes.
I'm still a little, I'm not sure I believe that they back then really believed that they could replicate the human mind with programming, but that's kind of the hearsay, if you will. But we've talked about that.
Yes.
So what do you see as the current, if I'm coming to the symposium in May, what are the applications that are on the docket to apply AI?
Yeah, it's a very interesting situation now, and I've been reading a lot about this. And let's first take the business world. Remember, in the 90s, the internet started to be useful for all kinds of business applications pretty early on, like email. Email is very important, and we got email pretty early. The World Wide Web, the ability to access information and be able to do things, electronic commerce, the ability to buy things online and so on. Those were, it was pretty clear how to convince a business, and that's what I, as a general manager of IBM's Internet division, we spent a lot of time doing that, where a number of companies and startups didn't realize is this is very good, e-commerce is very good, but to have a successful e-commerce business, you need a lot more than to be able to get a catalog and order. You need logistics, you need to figure out where the stuff is going to come, how long it's going to take to ship it. And that's why the applications, you could do things initially, but to really get a ROI of the kind that eventually Amazon was able to get and others, that's what takes a lot of the time to really be able to deploy it. Now we have AI as being very helpful in a variety of applications, like advising customer service representatives how to best deal with a question from a customer. One that I believe you have used yourself is when you're trying to program something, AI can significantly improve your productivity because you more or less show it the kind of program you want. It will search its huge databases and it will come back with suggestions. Remember, we're not at the point where you say, then you program it.
Well, and an example that you gave when we were talking the other day is some students who had a program written in Python and they wanted to change it to R.
Exactly.
The AI did the transformation.
The AI did the transformation, and before the students give it to the people that they were doing this for, they will check it to make sure it's right. That is, they won't just say it's going to do it. So the business applications are emerging, but depending on how you look, I've seen statistics that say maybe 10% of businesses are using AI. Some people say it's more, some people say it's less. There is no question when you get to the very top of Microsoft and Google and Salesforce and so on, they are more advanced. But when you start looking at small and mid-sized businesses, it's taking a while. This is not surprising. So in the business world, it's moving, but it's relatively slow. Allan, for a simple reason, we are in the early stages. I keep repeating that because everything you and I have studied about how long it takes technologies to make a huge dent tells us it's longer than people think because of all the things you need to do. Now, there is an area where there is agreement that AI is already having a huge impact, and that's the world of research. That's the world of new pharmaceuticals, new metals, new cures for cancer that are able to bring together the tumors with the DNA of the person who has the tumors and so on. And I think there are two key reasons, in my opinion, for that. First of all, in the research world, in the sciences, in physics, in astronomy, in biology, scientists have been using data analysis, big time data analysis, for a very, very long time. And AI, in the end, allows them to use much more powerful data analysis with multiple data sets and the GPUs and the powerful computers. So you have an incredibly educated, experienced set of people that are doing this work. And remember, the analysis that you use here has nothing to do with natural language or human understanding. You're using at some level the same things that people use in high energy physics to find the Higgs boson in 1989 and to find extragalactic planets in astronomy a decade or so later. And there is huge promise for that. So some things we're ready for, other things will take time. And the more you get to the business world, the more time it's going to get because you need to do so many more things.
So, Irving, we're getting towards the end of our time,
Yes,
so I have two more questions for you. Before I
please.
do, let me just add a couple to your list of things that are being focused on right now. So, I would say that, AI is being used by people for cybersecurity, also predictive maintenance, supply chain management. I think we mentioned human resources. Some people are using it to help with product development. As you mentioned, healthcare is a very popular application, and data analysis. So I'm just pointing out, there are a number of different.
But all the ones you mentioned, we are in the early stages. That's all I want to say.
No question, but I think that
That's all I want to say because this is very important. In the same way that let's say when Edison invented the electric light bulb, if somebody said, "Oh my God, this will lead to the assembly line, and this will lead to consumer appliances like refrigerators and washing machines," the answer is yes, it got them led to those things 30, 40 years later because
Well,
you
okay, so let's talk about just take a, put on your futurist hat and talk about the transformative power of AI. You've already mentioned, and I think that we're all in agreement that AI is going to have a transformative effect on healthcare. You know, it's research oriented. I think there's no question about that. But what are the other areas
oh,
where you think over time, and I'm talking about a decade or two, where you think it's going to have a transformative impact?
well, for sure in medicine, as you mentioned, for sure in helping us find, let's say, um, metals that are very strong and very light. So you could build cars and airplanes and so on that are much more energy efficient. That will come because AI, you can get down to the molecular level and use it to help you do things like that. I think one of the things where there is a lot of promise is in education, in
Yeah.
being like a really sophisticated tutor for anyone, for a child, and through school. But, Allan, we have seen, remember, PCs were supposed to revolutionize education. Do you remember that? And, and it was, let's get,
Well, certainly PCs have had an impact on education. Whether they revolutionized it, I don't know.
that's it. But in the early days, in the 90s, there was this promise that, PCs would revolutionize education. Well, they have made a difference. And in fact, what they have the big revolution is because you need to be IT knowledgeable. You need that to get a job. And so it's critical that all young people, as they are growing up, they learn the technology because they'll use it in their job one way or another. But, you know,
Well, and I would also add, with respect to PCs with education, PCs evolved into mobile devices
exactly.
evolved into social media, and social media in particular has had unintended consequences with respect to the health and welfare of young people, which was not anticipated during the
Exactly.
early days of the PC revolution.
And there is really, I read quite a bit about the promise of having every child have like an AI agent who advises them, who tutors them. But, then what people then say, Irving, there is a whole emotional aspect to education where the teachers get involved with the students and the teachers try to get the students to be excited about the subject. Now, if you're talking about the, I don't know, let's say 5–10% of young people who are incredibly motivated and who really want to run ahead on their own. And, you know, when they are in 6th grade, they start learning calculus and they'll get help from somebody. Yes, for some people, they can move much, much, much faster. But I think for the majority, it will take time. It will come. Then people talk about having, in the same way, AI be a kind of advisor as you're growing up. And then some people talk about AI as a friend. And then
Irving, what do you think the unintended consequences might be as AI evolves over the next decade or two?
I think some of them are like the unintended consequences of social media, where, you know, people, if you said to me, well, Irving, isn't it nice to have a friend? And if somebody is more introverted, you know, what if they have an AI friend? Well, there is a difference between having a human friend or a set of human friends with all the emotional parts of that than to have a friend that in the end is a machine and has no emotion.
You know, there was a story in the news today, not to get too contemporary, but I guess there is something called character.ai, and I guess a lawsuit's
Yes.
coming out that the AI influenced the young person to take some action.
Yeah, this young person who obviously had some mental problems got so involved with the AI that they didn't want to interact with anybody else because the AI was helping them feel so good. Now, what
That's the way I
people,
feel about my AI, Irving. Yeah.
yes, but you have your wife, your children, your grandchild, you talk to me, you talk to lots and lots of people, so you can do that. But if you only talk to your AI or mostly to your AI, and that's how you got your emotional needs fulfilled, you know, in fact, what the reason there is a lawsuit is because the kid was talking about suicide, and the AI should have had warnings. I mean, if a kid is in school and starts talking about suicide to his or her teacher, the teacher will immediately do something, take action, contact the principals, contact the family. So we all have a certain kind of normal human behavior in mind that the AI doesn't have because it's not human. Now, could you train the AI to recognize when somebody is not well? You can, but now we're underestimating the complexity of human emotions, and human emotions are very complicated. So it will do incredible things, but it will also not do some of the things we can expect. And I'll take the incredible things because I do think they will be superb. So I am really very positive on AI in its place.
All right. So, and I agree with you. I also am an optimist. I'm just going to throw out, one more question and then we'll come to a close.
Sure.
And that is, let's get back to the title of this podcast episode. How is AI likely to evolve in the future? I think we've talked about that. And then the second part is, and why is it so difficult to predict? I mean, here we are, we're sitting here, we're going to come to the symposium in May, but it's still going to be really hard to predict. Any
Well, in
comments on
fact, I would say one of the purposes of our symposium is to get the feedback from the CIOs, who in the end, remember, we call it the MIT Sloan CIO Symposium. So I'm looking forward to the symposium in May, to hear from the CIOs that are coming exactly the answer to that question, because they are where the rubber meets the road, because people are looking to them to see where we are in applications. And, they will come. There is no question in my mind. Some of the things we talked about, how do you use it for customer service? How do you use it for instruction? How do you use it for programming? And so on. All that will get much, much better. If you ask me when will it get better, Allan, I don't know the answer. If you ask me, when are we going to be able to have AI models that don't need a nuclear power plant for electricity generation, I think what happens with the biggest models like the ChatGPT 4.0 and beyond is that they are trying to do everything for everybody. There is a lot of work going on in open source AI models that are more domain specific. And in fact, most universities are doing research in those kind of much smaller domain specific models. And so if you do a model to just have a superb assistant for programming, and that model doesn't have to compose Shakespearean poems. So the amount of data it needs is going to be significantly less because it's domain specific. And I think we'll get lots and lots of those models. We may have some of the really big ones, but those are the ones that for now need the nuclear power plants. But I honestly think that the smaller open source models will dominate in the business world.
Sounds good. Well, Irving, with that, let me bring this episode to the close and say to our audience to thank you for joining us for episode 5. I will say, just so that you know, that Irving and I will be talking about other topics besides AI, including blockchain and virtual reality, and we have other things up our sleeve as well. So we'll be spreading our wings in the new year as 2025 comes. In the show notes, I'm going to have links to a number of Irving's blogs. If you haven't read his blog, I invite you to do that. He posts independently, but he also posts in the public square in our online community that you can access either as a friend or an innovator. So, come to our online community to read more of Irving's stuff. He has links to all the source material. And other than that, that's it. That's all we have for today. So have a good one. Take care. Bye-bye for now.
Bye.